I've called this panel the multi-tool for energy systems, because you'll see a lot of different applications here on this panel. Our moderator is Jesse Pielke. He's an energy professional from Cape Town, South Africa, the host of Hash Rate Up, a brilliant podcast you should watch. Has a background in mini grids, and he is sharp. Next up, we've got Ali Chehresaz. He's the founder, CEO of Terra Verde, serial entrepreneur, friend and advisor and mentor of mine. He consults on major solar projects and lives in a world of people who don't yet understand Bitcoin, but will appreciate it once they do. Erik Hersman, CEO of Gridless. I had the dung beetle up. Erik gave me a dung beetle t-shirt. Erik's company, as you'll see, doesn't just mine Bitcoin. They provide power to people who do not have power. Bitcoin is almost an afterthought in what they do, if you can believe it. It's inspiring, it's incredible. And you'll see more of it later in Lana's film today. Nuno Barbosa, founder, CEO, Unicarbo Energia, Biogas. Nuno does consulting and investing on emissions reductions projects. And it, does not come from the Bitcoin world, but comes from the world of energy professionals. And finally, Morton, Scaling Mining. Bitcoin miner from Ireland. Maybe you saw Joe Hall's documentary featuring his work. Does mining on anaerobic digestion. And I'll leave you to it, Jesse.
Is this thing on? Yeah. Hi. Hello, everybody. Nice and bushy-tailed. Good morning. Bit more cold this morning, so thank you very much for making it. We're going to talk about mining. We're not going to talk about the large data centers that all of you have seen on pictures, but we're going to talk about the bottom feeders of the system, the people who go out and find the cheapest sources of power. Why do we do that? Because at least I believe, and I've interviewed most of these guys for my show, and I know they also believe, that is the future, right? We're seeing large mega farms being built in the US. I don't think in 10 years you can allow yourself to blow megawatts of hot air into the sky because you'll have to compete. You'll have to compete with these guys who will for sure stay on the 50% side when it comes to the halvings coming up, not just this one, but the next and the one after that. And how do they do that? They each found a solution to find cheap power, right? You can do demand response, you can do heat reuse, you can do all kinds of other stuff to drive your all-in power costs down. But with these guys, it's not like that. They just went out and said, hey, we want cheap power as a base. And how do we do that? We find power that nobody else wants. So to start off, please go down the line and introduce your projects a bit more. And maybe while doing that, focus on the aspects of Bitcoin mining as a load that you use to make your project possible.
Is it on? Oh, perfect. So the vision for optimized infrastructure and how I stumbled into Bitcoin mining is to unleash growth of solar globally. My background as an engineer has largely been in developing solar infrastructure, and where I found Bitcoin mining interesting was in its ability to be a flexible buyer, consumer of electricity. And the world of solar development, while it has been around for a couple of decades in a commercially viable technology, is getting into a space where overproduction from solar is beginning to hurt itself. We use this phrase where solar is a prisoner of time and geography. And by that we mean you deploy solar where the resource is greatest, sunny areas, and solar only works during the times when the sun shines. That feature enables attracting solar in certain areas quite well. But at a certain point in time, when the grid is completely met and inundated by solar production, any more addition of solar to that grid is actually detrimental to the value economics of the investors that are behind that project. Where we saw this happening, it started to begin in the early 2012, 2014 in Hawaii, in California, and it was around that same time where we started to discover that there's this thing called Bitcoin mining that can buy power and pays you for the electricity it consumes, where otherwise nobody else would. That was the idea that sparked off the optimized infrastructure as the business that we're in, and the applications of it is vast. There are utilization of this in the large-scale solar development, all the way down to residential application. The areas that are interesting that I think we'll get into more talking today for us are how can we integrate Bitcoin mining into community solar-powered microgrids where there's no solution, there's no grid to areas of the world where they are left without access to electricity. Another application of it is utilizing Bitcoin mining in a DC-coupled system of solar and battery for residential backup power solutions. And this is an application of Bitcoin where, by utilizing its DC capability, we can increase the efficiency of the energy systems that ties solar and battery together. I'll pause here for...
Yeah, Erik, you want to go next?
I'm still trying to figure out how to make solar work for this, so I'm super interested to hear how you do it. So my name's Erik Hersman. I'm one of the founders of Gridless. At Gridless, we operate out of East and Southern Africa. What we do is we look for stranded power. This is largely renewable, all renewable, because that's what we have. We have a lot of pent-up energy in African markets that is based on hydro, geothermal, solar, and wind, and and biomass, which I'll come to in a second. And what we do is we just call up the different power producers that have made it and ask them, hey, so how much is being utilized by the community and the businesses that you're supposed to be serving? And most of the time that answer really caps out around 37%. And then we say, okay, well, would you like to utilize the rest of your power? Because we can bring in some Bitcoin mining containers, put them on the ground wherever you are. We'll cover the CapEx, and then we'll do a revenue share with you. So earlier you heard Troy talk about the inputs are what's actually different for your operational expenses. And that's the main differentiator for whether you're profitable or not as a Bitcoin miner. The way we reduce our risk on that front is we do revenue share with our power partners. So they actually make a percentage of the Bitcoin that we make. And some of them will hold it, some of them will sell it right away. It's up to them, and they get paid every day, which is something that they've never had before. And that's another story. But the interesting thing about it is that we found a lot of stranded energy, and we go to these power partners, and that's our direct relationship. But there's a third order effect, which is what it does for the communities when their power producer, their energy company locally, is finally financially sustainable, because they haven't been up until this point. When they're financially sustainable, what happens is they can expand their grid. They can actually pay for the meters now that will go into the next 200, 800 homes. And these are places that don't have power yet, right? These are, if we look at the numbers of the 1.1 billion people who don't have electricity in the world, over half of them are in Africa. So we're talking getting new energy, new electricity to people who've only had paraffin lamps and cooking with wood for their food, right? So this changes things immensely for them, and it's the power producers, these power developers that are going in and going to these hard places, but then coupled with Bitcoin mining that actually makes it financially sustainable. And when you have those kind of things that come together, you really can change what that rest of the world looks like to those people in those communities. I'll just finally say we have 6 sites in 3 countries, so Kenya, Malawi, and Zambia. And we work largely with hydro, but we've also gotten into geothermal and biomass over the last 5 months.
Hi. Hello? Oh, okay. Bom dia a todos. That's Portuguese for good morning to everybody. Name is Nuno Barbosa. I'm actually from Portugal, although I've been living in Brazil for the past 20 years. And I'm the founder of a company that has absolutely nothing to do with Bitcoin. Unicarbo is a company that provides solutions for landfill gas projects to generate electricity and carbon credits. Until 1.5 years ago, when Daniel first spoke with me, I thought that I had absolutely nothing to do with Bitcoin. But then he asked me the question, so from all the landfills in the world, how many landfills that could generate electricity are doing absolutely nothing? And I said 50%, which is a lot. We're talking about billions of tons of CO2 going directly to the atmosphere, and even worse, a huge potential of power generation that is not being used. And why not? Because, as Daniel said, there are regulatory restrictions in some countries, problems with access to networks, to electricity networks. So we would need a local consumption of electricity to use that huge potential that is not being used. And apparently, Bitcoin mining is a wonderful solution for that. So with Bitcoin mining and landfill gas put it together, we can simply solve three problems. Not using power potential that's not being used, we could use it. We can reduce emissions beyond, very much beyond the emissions that are being generated by the Bitcoin network. We can even trade carbon credits because it will be a carbon negative process. And we can solve one of the growing problems in the world, which is waste treatment. In low-income countries, 90% of the waste has absolutely no treatment and it's not used. Could be used for power generation, could be used to generate carbon credits, could be used to improve people's life, and is doing exactly the opposite because there are no opportunities to use that stranded potential, stranded energy. And my presence here has to do with that. It's a possible solution, and partnering with Daniel and with Bitcoin mining companies has been a challenge, has been the possibility to learn something that honestly 1.5 years ago I had no idea how it worked. So it's really, really good to contribute.
So I run Skilling Mining, which is Ireland's first and only Bitcoin mining company. I suppose my background is, again, nothing to do with energy, nothing to do with power. It's actually in mathematics. My general incentive to get into mining came more so from an interest in Bitcoin and relentlessly listening to Marty Bent talk about oil and gas fields and Bitcoin mining. So generally, my incentive was to create a startup in Bitcoin, and mining was the one I wanted it to be. So almost in a converse way, I went in search of a problem as opposed to immediately seeing what that problem was and thinking mining was the answer. I wanted to be a miner, and so I had to go and find a problem. And what I slowly started realizing is, look, Ireland doesn't have the oil and gas fields that the likes of the great American mining guys have, or Crusoe in parts of Texas and Wyoming and so on. But you know, what is our equivalent, or what can we do in Ireland that would be somewhat similar, or is a containerized off-grid / stranded asset model? And that journey started by looking at wind and solar and numerous other projects in Ireland. But ultimately for us in the early days, those projects were somewhat too big. As a small company getting up and running in Ireland, approaching a 80 megawatt wind farm isn't the easiest sell, asking them, can you put these mysterious servers on their site? So we basically started asking ourselves, is there another solution? What else is there in Ireland aside from wind and solar that could be a possible pairing for Bitcoin mining? And we started with the general ideology that an energy producer's inefficiency is going to be our opportunity. So we started asking around as to, what are the problems that people are experiencing in Ireland? And the first one was obviously wind and dispatch down. But we started asking, is there a smaller, more unique example of dispatch down? And ultimately found biogas. And biogas is unique in that it basically runs 99.99% of the time. And there's quite a lot of them in Northern Ireland. But there is certain examples where their energy production will exceed their MEC, or their maximum export capacity. So in that gap between what they can produce and what they can sell, there's an opportunity for a unique, location-agnostic, sovereign, independent buyer of power. And that was, in my mind, I was thinking quite one-dimensionally, and what I realized is that when I spoke to these biogas plant operators, yes, they wanted a demand that they could put on site to soak up the power, but they also wanted a demand that they could be in control of. So these people are quite sovereign, independent individuals. A lot of them are farmers that transitioned from farming to a new career, a new source of revenue. And the last thing that they wanted was to have that sovereignness and independence taken off them by the likes of a different data service provider that would put a demand on site and then tell them when they can and can't turn it off. So we kind of began that journey of looking around for biogas plants that was experiencing this problem, and in 2022 happened to find an individual that was looking for what he said was a compact use of his power, and mining was ultimately that perfect solution for him. So in 2022 we installed Ireland's first and only Bitcoin mine, and that's been running now for almost 2 years.
Amazing. So what I would like everybody to take away from this section is these guys are all selfishly creating win-win situations in various outcomes, right? They're all using Bitcoin mining as a first or last response or demand because it's location agnostic, works everywhere, and it's time agnostic, works anytime, ramps up and down really nicely, right? I know, a quick story, one of Erik's sites, for instance, used to use a heating element in the water to make sure that the frequency in the grid stays at 50 hertz. So basically just Gridless came in and said, hey, instead of heating up the water, give us the power and we'll pay you for it, right? So it's a no-brainer. What I would like to understand from each of you, now that we've sort of set the base, is how do we create more demand of regular power consumption wherever you are, right? Because at the end of the day, Bitcoin mining is great, right? But what we really want is we want to create more demand for regular power consumption so that Bitcoin mining can eventually, get smaller and smaller and smaller wherever you are. Maybe let's start on the other side this time in Ireland.
Can I ask Mark to tell the actual story of the farmer?
Yeah.
Please.
Yes, if anything, it was something that we were quite lucky with how it materialized. Like any early startup, we spent months looking for someone that would be willing to take this on, and he approached us in one of those situations where after 4 or 5 months of asking, you think, is anyone going to be willing to look at this and say, I understand it, I want to walk through this process with you? Because obviously Bitcoin in Ireland is quite an interesting topic for the majority of people, but the idea of Bitcoin mining is something even further afield. So Tom Campbell in Armagh in Ireland actually approached us and asking for a solution. So we were quite lucky in that he'd already had the groundwork from an energy perspective as to what he wanted, which is he wanted it to be compact, he wanted it to be relatively simple, but he also wanted independence over what he does with it. So if he wants to walk into the mine and switch all the machines off by hand without telling me, then he's welcome to go ahead and do that. So there was a few critical components that he brought to the conversation, and one of them, as I said, was the independent sovereign nature of a Bitcoin mine and the power generation that it consumes. So when I relayed what mining was, we had all the blueprints and the plans of how the container would look. and how it would literally sit on the top of the anaerobic digester because it's buried on his particular site. He said, look, I've been looking for something for at least 12 months to do this, and this is the perfect solution, essentially.
I mean, what's cool about this? Sorry, we'll go back to your question.
Go ahead.
But is like this is any farmer. This can be any farmer anywhere can build this kind of thing as long as they have the ability to create the gas, right?
Yeah, so I suppose there's a few caveats to that, which is in Ireland, in Northern Ireland specifically, there was incentives to go ahead and build these plants, and it was up to individual farmers to essentially create their own business plan as to how they would go ahead and deliver it. So it's up to them to find their own feedstocks, to partner with people that they need to essentially bring in enough biomass or feedstocks, whatever word you want to use, and then after that point, it's up to you to figure out how you can make this thing stack up. So there was a variety of situations along that process where, biogas plants would be built, the grid doesn't materialize in the way they expected, and then they're left to try to figure out what to do or circumnavigate those issues. So the only limitation that I would say is that, building the biogas plants day one for the sole purpose of mining from an efficiency standpoint, I would say isn't the best way to go about it. The plants take a long time to build, they can be quite expensive, but where mining really excels in those situations is if the plants are already being built or they have been built and then they're experiencing issues. So again, what I try to explain to people in Ireland when you hear discussions around mining being kind of a negative load for any grid system is that mining is never going to come along and compete with any other form of energy consumer, especially not in Ireland where if you can sell the power to the grid, you'll probably get 10, 15, 20 cents for it per kilowatt. So this idea of mining coming along and trying to compete or drive up energy prices in the EU, to anyone that understands the economics of mining knows it's nonsensical. So where mining really is an ideal buyer is when an issue already exists and it can come along and plug that issue after.
In various forms, regulation creates that misallocation of capital around energy and creates pockets that we all love. But again, how do you guys bring on more regular demand for power? How do you help grids in Ireland, grids around the world with solar, off-grids, grids in Brazil, off-grid as well? How do you manage to bring more industry and residential loads online? Ale, you want to go first? Okay. Yeah.
Well, I think that question has, again, a lot of caveats, which is it depends on the grid system that you're operating in. So I think from an Irish perspective, if we're being upfront and honest, a lot of the wind farms that are being built are going to operate under this expectation of getting a lot of cents per kilowatt, to say the least. And there's a general question that I've realized when doing modeling around mining and where it fits best is that there's always a different model for the grid system that you're operating in. In the EU, we have such high pricing on grid that if there's any means possible to get that power to the grid, you're going to do that over mining. And so we're still in a situation in the EU where people that are building out their renewable assets are almost spoilt with the idea of what's an appropriate price per kilowatt for their power. So when you say to them, look, your grid connection is delayed, we can bring that forward for you by 18 months, but we can only give you 4 or 5 cents. Their initial reaction in the EU is, oh no, I'll just wait, because when I get there, I get 16. And obviously you've all the ongoing concern and the risk associated with mining, but when you're in a much more competitive grid system, say in parts of Australia where you've a 140 megawatt solar farm and you're experiencing negative pricing or you're clipping on a regular basis, then that's where mining is a really unique integration for those large scale solar farms, where it actually is competitive versus the price that you're getting on grid. So when we talk about, I think, building greater renewable capacity, I think we have to always think of it in a jurisdictional basis, which is, yes, mining can offer quite a lot of value in these low-cost grid systems, but in the very, very high-cost grid systems like Ireland, for example, where prices at times can go 20, 30, 40 cents plus per kilowatt, you have to always add the caveat, which was mining won't compete with it, and it shouldn't compete with it in those grid systems. And for the foreseeable in Ireland, I think projects will still be built with the pre-consumption that they have to get to grid. And perhaps it'll be very, very different then in the lower systems.
Nuno, you want to go next?
Yeah, I can. Well, it's funny because apparently The power generation in my area, landfill gas, has a completely different focus than the Bitcoin mining company. My clients want to sell electricity at a very high price. Bitcoin mining companies want to buy electricity or use electricity at a very low price, except for everybody who can't. And as I said, there are several problems with exporting, with selling electricity. Regulation, network access, network quality, and variation of prices. Electricity market is completely crazy, and the price changes a lot. So the answer to your question is focus. We have to focus, at least in my area, we have to focus in places where the only possibility to sell electricity is a local consumption center or data center. With that, we can create conditions to install a power generation, and maybe in 10 years, in 15 years, the market changes and you have created a permanent source of emission reduction and of power production that started up with the help of Bitcoin mining. I think that is the solution. In my case, the answer is focus in certain places, in certain areas where you have this huge potential that is not being used.
All right. Erik, you want to go next?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the problem sets are completely different that we're each going against, and oftentimes the geography is the important part of that, right? So for us, it's interesting. There's a pent-up demand for energy, right? And in Africa, you really see that it's that base layer for human progress. You need electricity so that you can kind of level up in the world, right? And so everybody wants it, but people can't afford it. And the national grids have gone about as far as they will go. And so what that means is that people are not able to get electricity, and the distribution of that power is not as broad as you would think, right? And so the only way to increase this is think about new ways to put power in these places. And this is what these independent power producers are doing when they go out and build mini grids. And the problem has been, there's an endemic problem, it's a structural problem in the financing of new energy in Africa, especially small energy. And that's because the financiers around it are largely concessionary financiers from African Development Bank, European Development Bank, Rockefeller Foundation, these kind of organizations, right? And they don't think the same way as investors or normal capitalists would. But why aren't investors or normal capitalists investing in energy if there's this pent-up demand? Well, because the business model for mini grids is broken and they're not financially viable. So why would you put your money into them, right? That doesn't make any sense to actually put money into an investment that you cross your fingers and hope will make you a return in 30 years. It won't, and it never happens, right? We haven't found, I'm sure there's somebody out there who's profitable. We have not found them yet, right? So this is where Bitcoin mining actually becomes a silver bullet, right? There's never silver bullet solutions, but it kind of feels like there's one here, right? Where when Bitcoin mining comes in, it becomes that either anchor tenant on a new site or the buyer of last resort on a site that's underperforming, in that it doesn't have the expected growth in usership, in the user base in that community. Then you actually have something new. You actually have a new model that didn't exist before. And while Gridless has been about, we've come along and found the stranded energy and then go put our mining there, I think the future looks like bundling of energy development plus Bitcoin mining at new sites to drive electrification further to the edges in Africa. Maybe in other parts of the world too, but all I know is Africa, so I won't speak to them. And this is where it's interesting, because I think with Ali's, he's doing solar, we haven't been able to figure out solar at all. And I'm curious to, when you look at the energy problem in Africa, really 90% of it could be solved by solar, but the financial backside of that doesn't seem to work out. And so I'm super curious to how you guys are looking at it and solving for that.
No, unlocking the project finance for these applications is the holy grail. And this has not been figured out yet. And yet is the key word, because we are in the early stages of getting there. A lot has to change: public narrative, understanding of project, being comfortable with the load balancing feature of Bitcoin mining. And I believe we are going to get there. To answer your question about how can we create this energy abundance, which is one of the themes, memes of Bitcoin, right? It creates energy abundance. It's about, and you're using the lens of the energy infrastructure, it's about making visible the as yet invisible, right? How much could there be done that we can imagine it, but it's not there yet in the world. And because of Bitcoin's unique needs in utilizing what used to be low-cost power, but I think that era is over. We now need to go into zero-cost or negatively cost power. This is why projects that you're hearing about are beginning to work, like landfill gas, for example, is that Bitcoin miners are utilizing that need for zero to negative cost electricity, therefore wasted electricity, to turn this mirror on society and show us where is all the waste that exists currently in our energy infrastructure, right? We've been at power development business for more than 100 years now. Our grid is about 100 years old since it got invented. And what we have right now is the magic of this grid, which is beautiful. It takes a lot of hard work to get us to where we are. But together with that, we also have escalating energy costs. We have increasingly unreliable power grid. And we have, as Erik said, over 1 billion people without access to electricity. This is where we've gotten after 100 years of energy infrastructure development, capital investment. Where can Bitcoin take us next? This is where microgrids are very interesting to us. And if you were to look at the energy infrastructure landscape in the world, like the iceberg analogy, right now we're looking at the tip of the iceberg where we're seeing all the wasted energy that exists in our existing built infrastructure. The portion of the ice below the water level is where we get excited about, which is, let's go put in DC-coupled solar battery microgrids to a location where there's no electricity, utilize Bitcoin mining to increase the utilization rate. What did you say was the typical utilization of grids, 36%?
Yeah, the highest we've seen is about 36.
We can take that up to 70% plus by having Bitcoin miner be a buyer of that electricity.
So can I ask a question?
Please, Erik.
So I love what Ali's doing, and I really want to dig into this for a second. Like, how do you? Okay, so energy doesn't like to move, and it doesn't like to stay in one place either for very long. It's hard to store it. So with solar, do you add a bunch of battery storage, which is prohibitively expensive usually?
Can I add a question? What does that do to power cost if you add batteries?
So the overall infrastructure cost of solar plus battery is more than solar alone. That's a given. However, if you follow the cost curve that batteries are taking now, and this past week there was actually an announcement by Cato, they've dropped the cost of batteries down by like 50% from what they had previously. Come along the journey a few years down the line, look at what has happened to the cost of solar panels, what you're seeing with the cost of batteries. Add on top of that what Bitcoin mining forces these systems to redo, which is the DC coupling side, and I'll dig into that for a bit here. Sorry for the nerd talk, but all of our energy infrastructure has been designed around AC syncing systems. Our grid is run by AC power. That battle was won about 100 years ago again. And all of our solar infrastructure system for the past 2 decades, that's been the commercially available landscape, let's call it, has been DC-powered panels that convert electricity from DC to AC to feed the grid. Batteries have been around for a while. We've started to co-locate batteries with solar, but batteries store power in DC, but they convert it to AC in order to integrate with the grid, with the home, to do that power connection. The integration of solar and batteries, as it has been happening in the last decade, has been on AC-coupled systems. There is a lot of waste just within that system by itself. From solar panels going to the inverters, that's capital cost. There's a loss of now, the best inverters give you about 2 to 3% energy loss from DC to AC. That's not too bad. On the battery side, the whole round trip cycling of going from DC to AC and back to charge and discharge, you lose at best 10%, at worst 15% of the electricity. Combination of all of these, utilizing a grid as your mechanism to deliver power to you and given the economics that the grid offers you, has gotten us to a place where we now oversupply on the DC side by a 1.3 to 1.5 factor DC over AC. And we essentially clip and waste a ton of DC solar power because financially it actually makes sense to do that right now because of the grid as a buyer of electricity. Remove the grid, go to a region where there's no power grid, where people want the electricity, and their otherwise available option is burning wood or propane. Put together a DC coupled system where you remove the 50% waste on the AC inverter clipping side, you remove the inverter losses, and you remove the battery AC-DC conversion loss, you get a lot more efficiency that you otherwise would not have had, where the economic model for a deployment of that system in, say, California may not work, but when you look at it as a standalone DC system elsewhere where the people want that power, it starts to make more sense.
So like DC directly into the miner.
Correct.
Yeah, so like there's a crazy gap in like the icy prairies of North America, like 100-acre ranch who's doing something like that,
Yeah,
right?
he's doing completely off-grid setup with that system.
So that same idea is you can be completely kind of an island for your own energy and you don't have to care about what everybody else does. That's why it works.
Correct.
Okay.
Now, the notion here is the 100 acres ranch is mining purely with solar for mining. The goal we're thinking about is use mining to use the power that, let's say, in that village would not be used at that time. Because the unreliability of the buyer of electricity, that's the human activity, needs to be balanced by Bitcoin miners.
Typically, when people come to me and say, hey, I want to put solar on my roof so I can do Bitcoin mining, I say, don't do that. It's not a good idea, right? Use the excess, use the opportunity cost of zero. I think after the 5th time that you said AC/DC, I'm not sure how many people we lost. Not that many, good. So one thing I'm not worried about is the money, right? Paradoxically, the fiat price really has a big influence on how much Bitcoin mining can do because it's the capital intensive side of Bitcoin, right? If Bitcoin price goes up, we can do a lot more, right? We can fund transformers, infrastructure, we can build containers, we can buy the ASICs and all the rest of it. Back when Bitcoin was worth nothing, it was really hard to convince capital allocators to buy transformers at the megawatt scale, right? And today we're consuming a lot more power than back then. So fiat price go up is good for Bitcoin mining. Also similarly, I'm not too worried when it comes to funding because I see all of these big guys, and at this conference I've only met one NASDAQ-listed mining company, Marathon, being here. And they're all looking at you, right? They're all looking at you because they understand what I said in the beginning. They cannot afford to pay other people's margin down the line, and they cannot afford to blow hot air into the sky, and they need cheap power and geodiversification. So going solar, going to Africa, going to South America, doing gas in Ireland or in Europe more generally might be a good idea, right? So the question I have for you is, how capital intensive, because I think that is one of the downsides that you guys all have, right? It's really expensive to do solar. Your OPEX is higher. Gas generators are much more expensive than transformers, not just to maintain, but also to buy. How do you compete while you have cheaper power with the parties in the network that have much lower investment costs than you do? Ali, you want to start?
Yeah, I think unlocking that capital that is currently sitting and only focused on energy infrastructure and is not looking at Bitcoin is the dam we want to break. You look at the forecast projections of how much money is being earmarked for energy infrastructure investment over the next 30 years, it's in the $150 trillion range. If we can get a portion of that to start to pay attention to Bitcoin mining, not as a need to go mine Bitcoin with energy, but use it to do more energy, I think we've done a huge service to humanity. How we compete with it, I think this is where the hustle of Bitcoin miners, the work that folks here are doing, will come into play, and we have to show more and more of these narratives to the world, which is currently what we know is in a project in South Africa we're working on is The grid is unreliable. They have load shedding events. People are installing...
Extremely unreliable. I suffer from it every day.
Yeah. People are installing rapidly batteries that are powered with solar in order to have backup power for security of gates, homes. Those systems, you look at the math and physics behind it, people are paying premium money in order to get security for using solar and battery. That makes sense. The system has set that up. But you also look underneath it, you see there's a ton of solar power that's being wasted, not going anywhere. You start to look at that equation where you have a buyer at a home who's willing to pay for security through solar and battery, and you have the financier who's financing those systems. You look at the financial pro forma of that project, and you see that with some engineering, you can increase and optimize that system size, utilizing Bitcoin mining, where the returns on capital that goes into solar and battery is now higher, accretively higher. The homeowner still gets the backup power. They might even get some offset electricity usage with that additional solar. But all of that can happen when you start to integrate mining into that application. So it's a very specific case of it, but it's one where the use case of it starts to make sense. And
I mean, look, we got to keep it brief because 15 minutes have never gone this fast. Add to the elevated capex that you have the potential or the high danger for lower uptimes as well, right? So please keep going, Erik. You want to next?
So I think this is the interesting part about Bitcoin mining is where does it's capital intensive, right? So if we're putting out a 20-foot container full of 144 Bitcoin miners that's going to take 500 kilowatts, we know that's going to cost us between $150 to maybe up to $200,000, depending how far, if we have to truck it overland, 2,000 kilometers to Zambia or not, right? Those
including
things.
Or excluding ASICs?
What's that?
Including or excluding ASICs?
Including ASICs, including miners, right? So what's interesting here is it's expensive, right? But you know what's expensive? More expensive is developing a project that doesn't make any money, right? That's a lot more expensive. So I remember when we were first raising our capital, we sound a little bit like an NGO to people, the way we talk about what Gridless does. We're not. We're a for-profit company that does Bitcoin mining. And the mission is also to push electrification further to the edges in Africa and decentralize the Bitcoin network, okay? However, when we were first raising our capital, it was coming from two different groups. It was coming from people who are interested in Bitcoin, but it was also coming from energy developers or energy financiers who had built a lot of energy and weren't seeing returns on it. I remember from one investment committee meeting, the people who were looking at our investment, the very first funders of us, the guys looked in the room and everybody didn't want to fund anything that had anything to do with Bitcoin because there's perception of Bitcoin and specifically the risk on their persons, on their reputations because they did something with Bitcoin, right? And so the manager of the fund stood up and said, listen, for 10 years, we've tried to make energy products or projects in Africa financially sustainable and nothing else has worked. If you can't come up with a better way to make them financially viable, then I'm going to greenlight this project. The room was silent, so the project was greenlit and we got our first financing, right? So that's how you get... The free market wants to put money into things that grow, and they don't have to be big believers in Bitcoin as the financial product. They just have to know it works for them and makes them financially viable.
Yeah, Nuno, you're next.
Well, the good thing in speaking in third place is that I can use the smart things people said before me.
That's why I switch it up. That's why I switch it up.
Yeah. Well, answering your question, how do we compete? We don't. There's no possibility. So we go where no one else is going for whatever reason, because it's not possible. There's no network. There's no possibility to sell electricity. So we don't compete. And picking up your sentence, more expensive than financing a project that doesn't make any money is wasting a project that could make money and it doesn't. And in our case, there is really a lot of potential that can be used. And it's not used, and I think it's the 10th time that I'm going to say this, because it's not possible. There's no regulation, there's no network, there's no access. So honestly, we cannot compete with selling high-cost electricity to a network. So we basically use what no one else is using.
Can you, Nuno, because out of all of you, you're the only project that has an additional revenue source,
yeah.
right? All of these guys are using cheap power, but Nuno is also involved in carbon credits, which can be seen as an additional revenue source for mining. Just briefly, between Bitcoin mining and the carbon credits, what's the sort of revenue split up with? Is it 80% mining revenue, 20% carbon credit? What's the mix?
Yeah, I would say that carbon credits add maybe, I would compare it more with electricity. With electricity, I would say that it can add maybe 30% to the income.
Okay, that's insane.
Yeah, it is. Because in the case of methane, you get a huge potential for reducing emissions just for destroying methane, okay? Not just for the power generation.
Right, Mark. What's the uptime with you guys? How do you compete with the bigger guys on the capex side?
Well, I think I'm glad we've brought it up, is the question I always ask myself is, even though the bigger guys have access to cheaper capital overall, are they even deploying it efficiently? And I think that's a question that isn't being asked in the mining industry as a whole over the past 12 to 18 months, which is, I find it really interesting with all the people sitting here, and why I'm such a fan of Gridless specifically is every miner has to go and find out what their own financial incentives are to set up a mine. So is it to be the most efficient miner in the world, running 100% of the time? If the answer is yes, then you need to be achieving a significant discount to the spot price of Bitcoin to justify your existence. If your incentives are for mini grids in Africa and you're building a greater picture where energy is an incentivization, you're getting kickback from the energy asset itself, they're benefiting, then that's fine. But I think over the past 12 to 18 months, there's been a disparity as to why you should mine in the first place, which is there's a lot of, I feel, companies out there that are mining for the sake of mining. When you look at the opportunity that exists to mine, you've one purpose, day one, which is if you want to be the best miner in the world, then achieve a significant discount to the spot price of BTC. Otherwise, just don't do it at all. Just buy a Bitcoin on the market if you're not achieving that. So I think what we need to start asking ourselves is, why are we installing mining in the first place? And we have a lot of conversations around, wasted wind in Ireland, for example. People will tweet, an article to me saying, look at all this wasted power. And I go back to them and say, this happens over a 2-week period in December. So as much as they're 80 megawatts, I'm not going to install mining to run 8% of the year. That energy company isn't going to buy the mining off me to make that marginal gain. So I think overall, we need to start asking ourselves not about the overall cost of capital, but why are we installing it in the first place? And if we do have access to cheap capital, are we deploying it efficiently, or are we just focusing on maximizing hash rate for the sake of it? And I think it's one of those things where people keep asking, why does hash rate keep rising? Is it some mysterious entity somewhere that we don't know about? I think the kind of general opinion is, from my own end, is people are deploying hash rate for the sake of deploying it. And that's why we're seeing hash rate skyrocketing relentlessly and people ticking off their hash rate expansion goals instead of someone saying, well, should you have just bought Bitcoin instead? What is the purpose of installing that hash rate if there's not an alternative incentive besides achieving a spot price to BTC?
All right, guys. Before we close out here, a question that I always ask last on my show, shameless plug, you can find that on Swan's YouTube channel, is does Bitcoin consume enough electricity? Right. So with the 20 minutes we have left, Ali, go first. Does Bitcoin consume enough electricity? Yes or no?
So I've answered this question on your show before, and my answer is no, it does not. Reason being everything we've talked about, which is the only reason Bitcoin will use more electricity is because it's creating more value in the energy infrastructure, broadly speaking. So,
Erik?
Yeah, I would lean. I think it's a relative question to when you are in time, but I think I would say that no, because it's actually what secures the Bitcoin. It's what secures Bitcoin, right? And so the more power we have behind it, the more secure Bitcoin can be, and I think that's the real value. And there's also the other side of the equation around more energy is needed. So I think for both reasons, it's no.
All right, Nuno?
Well, not a Bitcoin specialist, but I'm going to answer from my point of view. I would say not enough, because we want to promote projects. In our case, it is really helping us to create a market, to develop projects. So it should spend more.
All right, more is better. Hash rate up. Mark?
I would generally say that because of the nature of the difficulty adjustment, the mining network is always consuming the amount of energy that it needs and wants to consume. Because if it's, ultimately consuming too much in quotes, then the network will adjust up. If it's consuming too little, it'll adjust down. So it's always right, I suppose.
Yep. All right, hash rate up is good. Hash rate up means more competition. Hash rate up means more of these use cases will come around, and I'm sure they're here to stay. Guys, give it up for your panelists. Thank you very much. I hope you learned something new. Come find us after. Ask us all the questions you have left. And yeah, with that being said, all the best. Thank you very much. Enjoy the conference. Thank you. Bye-bye.